In the year 1361, a man named Thomas walked through the emptiness of London and understood, for the first time in his life, that he was free and that freedom was the most terrifying thing he had ever experienced. The great mortality had come and gone like a fever that breaks, but leaves the body forever changed. The plague that had entered Europe through the Mediterranean trade routes in 1348, that had killed perhaps a third of the entire continent's population in the space of just 5 years, that had transformed thriving cities into graveyards and vital trade networks into paths of contagion, had finally begun to release its grip. But what it left behind was not a world ready to return to normal. What it left behind was a world so fundamentally transformed that the very concept of normal no longer existed. Everything that had seemed permanent was revealed to be fragile. Everything that had seemed eternal was shown to be temporary. Thomas had been a blacksmith's apprentice when the plague arrived in 1348. When he was barely more than a boy of 13 years old, he had expected to spend his entire life doing what his father did, what his father's father had done, and what generations of blacksmiths before them had done working metal, serving his craft with absolute obedience to the guild belonging to a structure that had stood unchanged and seemingly unchangeable for centuries. The apprenticeship was harsh in ways that modern people would find almost incomprehensible. He worked from before dawn to after dark. He received no wages, only food, often meager, and a sleeping place, usually shared with other apprentices in a cold, damp room. He was beaten regularly for mistakes, for slowness, for any infraction of the countless rules that governed every moment of apprentice life. The master craftsman had absolute authority over him, more absolute even than a father had over his children. He could beat his apprentices for any reason or no reason. He could withhold food as punishment. He could forbid them from leaving the workshop, from visiting family, from any form of social contact outside the shop. An apprentice who ran away could be branded with a hot iron, mutilated, imprisoned, or worse. But this was considered entirely normal. It was how the system worked. It was the only way to learn a trade, according to guild theory. The logic was that the harshness of the apprenticeship taught discipline, obedience, and the respect for authority that would be necessary to function in guild society. An apprenticeship typically lasted 7 to 14 years, depending on the complexity of the craft and the whim of the master. At the end of it, if you survived it, and if you had learned well enough to meet the master's standards, you would become a journeyman, a skilled worker who could be hired by others. If you accumulated enough money and impressed the established guild masters sufficiently, if you created a masterpiece that demonstrated your skills and paid the substantial fees that the guild demanded, you might eventually become a master yourself, able to open your own shop and take your own apprentices. This was the path that Thomas expected to follow. It was predictable in its outline, though harsh in its specifics. You inherited your father's trade, or were apprenticed to a master in that trade. You served your time, learning the skills and internalizing the rules. You became a journeyman, worked for established masters, slowly accumulated capital. You married into another craft family, creating business alliances that would help you eventually become a master. You followed all the rules of your guild, paid all the fees, participated in all the ceremonies and processions and religious observances that the guild required. You built your reputation and your status slowly over decades, and then you died, having worked your entire life, and your son inherited your shop. This was simply the order of things, ordained by tradition and enforced by the power of the guild. It was not questioned because it seemed inevitable, eternal. But in 1348, this eternal system began to crack and then to shatter completely. The plague came to London in the summer of 1348, arriving on merchant ships from the Mediterranean. It appeared first as rumor stories of a terrible disease in Asia, then in the Middle East, then in North Africa. Merchants reported seeing people dying in ports along the trade routes, but people in Northern Europe didn't believe it would reach them. They thought the plague was something that happened in distant, exotic places, a punishment on people they considered less civilized. They were wrong. The disease reached England in the autumn of 1348 and spread through London like fire through dry grass. It killed with extraordinary speed. People who seemed healthy in the morning were dead by evening. Those infected developed dark swellings in their armpits and groin, about the size of eggs or apples. Blood oozed from lesions on their skin. They developed high fevers and vomited blood. Most people died within days of falling ill. Some lasted a week or two. Almost nobody recovered. Medical knowledge offered no cure. Prayer offered no protection. Doctors with their leeches and bloodletting made things worse, not better. Thomas's master, a man named John Cooper, died in the spring of 1349 in the first waves of plague hitting London. John was a man in his 50s, respected in the metalworking guild, successful in his business, with a wife named Margaret and 4 children. Within 3 weeks of John falling ill with the plague, all of them were dead. Thomas watched as his master grew increasingly delirious, his skin covered in the dark swellings of the bubonic plague, the smell of his infection filling the workshop and becoming unbearable. Thomas's fellow apprentices, watching this horror, began to flee. They ran out of the workshop one by one, running into the countryside, seeking safety in isolation. But Thomas, unable to believe that the master would actually die, unable to imagine a world without the structure that had contained him for the past 5 years, stayed. He helped Margaret, John's wife, tend to John as he died. He watched her grow sick. He saw her grow delirious. He heard her crying out in pain and fear, and then he helped wrap her body and prepare it for burial in a mass grave. When the master's children fell ill one by one, Thomas stayed again, unable to comprehend the finality of what was happening. When they died, one by one, in the space of just days, Thomas was there. When a relative of John's appeared briefly from their living quarters to demand that Thomas leave, to get out of her house, to go away and take his disease with him, Thomas obeyed. But he didn't flee far, didn't run to the countryside like the other apprentices. He found shelter in an abandoned building nearby. And when it became clear that the master's entire household was completely gone, when it became clear that the death that had seemed impossible was now irrevocable, Thomas returned to the workshop. He found it empty. The tools were still there, arranged as the master had left them. The forge was still there, its metal cold for the first time in years. The various work-in-progress projects remained scattered on benches and in corners, partially completed swords, unfinished hinges, half-worked armor pieces. The place smelled of metal and ash and the ghost of the master's presence. He could have left, could have abandoned this place and sought his fortune elsewhere. Many apprentices did exactly that. Many journeymen used the chaos to abandon their previous masters and start fresh somewhere else. But Thomas, moved by something he didn't fully understand, loyalty, fear, or simply the profound disorientation of having lost his entire known world, chose to stay. He cleaned the workshop, a major undertaking. He worked the forge himself, something that would have been absolutely forbidden before the plague. He began experimenting with the techniques he had been learning through those long years of harsh apprenticeship. He made simple goods nails, hinges, basic tools, practical items. He wasn't very skilled yet. His work was crude compared to what Master Cooper would have produced, but it was functional. It was usable. When a merchant passed by the workshop one day in 1350, looking for metalwork, Thomas offered to sell him some of the items he had made. To his surprise, the merchant agreed to buy. He paid a reasonable price for rough but serviceable goods. This small transaction, a merchant buying goods from an inexperienced apprentice who had no right to practice his craft, who belonged to no guild, who had no master to vouch for him, would have been absolutely forbidden in the pre-plague world. The guild would have destroyed his goods. They would have beaten him. They would have forbidden the merchant from buying from him. They would have confiscated any money he received. They might have branded him as a scab craftsman, a violator of the guild's sacred rules. They would have made an example of him to discourage others from breaking guild law. But in the chaos of 1350, with so many guild masters dead, with much of the normal structure of urban life simply ceasing to function, there was no one to enforce these rules. The guild's authority, which had seemed absolute, which had seemed backed by the force of tradition and law and divine sanction, was simply gone. The guild had lost so many of its masters to the plague that it could unenforce its rules. The city government was overwhelmed, trying to handle the dead, trying to prevent complete social collapse. Nobody cared about an apprentice selling goods. Over the following months, Thomas discovered that he was not alone in this situation. Throughout London, throughout Europe, throughout the Christian world, apprentices were completing their master's work. Journeymen were opening shops of their own without waiting for guild permission. People with no formal training in a craft were learning the basics through experimentation and necessity and beginning to produce goods. The normal structures of craft production had collapsed, not through any conscious rebellion, not because anyone had decided that the guild system was unjust and should be overthrown, but simply because too many of the people who enforced those structures had died. The system had depended on continuity, on tradition, on the passage of knowledge from masters to apprentices across generations. When an entire generation of masters was wiped out, when apprentices had no masters to learn from, When the very people who constituted the guild's authority simply disappeared, the system broke. For 10 years after 1349, Thomas lived in this strange liminal space. He was no longer truly an apprentice. That position had become meaningless without a master. But neither was he a recognized member of the craft. He was a journeyman by one definition as skilled worker, but without the formal status that traditionally accompanied that designation. He worked, he learned, he experimented, constantly improving his skills. He took on other forms of work when there was nothing to do in the smithy. He moved between different cities, seeking where his labor was most needed and most valued. He went to Canterbury. He went to Bristol. He worked in small villages in the countryside. He lived as a free laborer in a world that was supposed to have no free labor. The plague came in waves throughout this decade. After the initial catastrophic outbreak of 1348 to 1349 that killed perhaps a third of Europe's estimates, put it as high as 40 or 50% in urban areas, there were recurring waves of plague in 1361 to 1362, in 1369, in 1375, and continuing throughout the century. Each subsequent wave killed fewer people than the last, partly because gradually some immunity developed in the survivors and their descendants, and partly because there were simply fewer people left to kill. But each wave was still devastating. Each wave reminded survivors that death was not yet finished with them, that the plague was not just a temporary catastrophe, but a permanent feature of the post-plague world. During these years of recurring plague, Thomas witnessed transformations that would have been utterly unthinkable in the pre-plague world. He watched as the rigid hierarchies of urban labor simply ceased to function. Without guild enforcement, without masters to control production, without the entire institutional structure that had maintained medieval labor discipline, the normal rules of medieval craftsmanship collapsed. People who had no training took up crafts. Women, normally forbidden from practicing most trades, began working in their families. Shops with no opposition from guild authorities, too busy dying or dealing with fundamental survival to enforce the old rules. Prices for goods dropped significantly as more people began producing them, destroying the guild's ability to control prices. Wages for labor rose steadily as survivors became increasingly scarce and employers competed desperately to secure workers. This inversion of the pre-plague economy was the most fundamental change in European society since the fall of Rome. Before the plague, labor had been the cheapest commodity, almost worthless. There were always more people willing to work than there were jobs available. A master craftsman could abuse his apprentices because there were dozens of other boys desperate for the opportunity to apprentice, willing to take their place if they ran away. The lord could pay his laborers subsistence, wages barely enough to survive, because there were always more peasants desperate for work, always more people who needed employment to live. Skilled workers might earn more than unskilled workers, but all workers were cheap, replaceable, easily controlled. The fundamental logic of medieval labor was that workers were abundant and therefore powerless. But the plague changed this in the most direct way possible. With so many people dead, with labor in desperately short supply, with entire trades lacking skilled practitioners, the surviving workers found themselves in an unprecedented position. They had leverage. They could demand higher wages. They could move between employers, knowing that employers would compete for their services. They could refuse to work under the brutal conditions that had previously been normal. They could simply walk away if they didn't like their situation, confident that they could find work elsewhere at better rates. Thomas first became fully aware of this shift in power when a farmer came to the workshop in 1361, looking for someone to help with harvest work. In the pre-plague world, such work would have been done by peasants bound to the lord's manor, working from obligation rather than choice. If that bound labor wasn't available, the farmer would have sought day laborers willing to work for barely enough to survive, perhaps a few coins and a meal. But in 1361, the farmer had to compete for Thomas's labor. He offered wages that would have seemed impossibly high before the plague. He offered good food. He offered decent lodging. He offered a choice in whether Thomas wanted to work or not. Thomas, finding the smithy work less urgent in the slower season, agreed to help with the harvest. But he did something that would have been shocking and would have been severely punished before the plague. He negotiated. He asked for more money than the farmer had initially offered. He asked for the right to leave if better work became available. He asked for his own tent instead of sleeping in the barn with the other laborers. The farmer, desperate and unable to find other workers, agreed to most of his demands. A man and a farmer discussing the terms of labor as something approaching equals this was revolutionary. This sign a laborer negotiating with an employer as something approaching equals was being repeated across Europe in the 1350s and 1360s, and would continue throughout the following decades. Peasants were demanding the right to pay rent instead of performing feudal labor service. Craftsmen were demanding higher wages and better working conditions. Servants were demanding the right to leave their employers if they wished. The entire power structure of medieval society, which had been built on the assumption that labor was cheap and abundant and had to be strictly controlled through force and law and custom, was beginning to crack fundamentally. The response from the ruling classes was swift and harsh. Kings and nobles, sensing that their wealth and power were threatened by a suddenly empowered working class, began passing laws designed to force wages back down to pre-plague levels and to reimpose the old labor discipline. In England, King Edward III, seeking to maintain control over labor and preserve the wealth of the landholding classes, passed the Statute of Laborers in 1351. This law attempted to freeze all wages at their pre-plague rates and forbidding workers from moving between employers. It permitted masters to hire workers, but at rates determined by law, not by negotiation between parties. It punished workers who demanded higher wages with imprisonment or mutilation. It punished workers who broke their contracts with harsh punishment. Similar laws were passed throughout Europe, the Ordinance of Laborers in France, laws in Germany and the Low Countries and Italy, all attempting to suppress wages and restore the pre-plague labor discipline. But laws are only as powerful as their enforcement, and enforcement requires cooperation and resources. And the people who would have done the enforcing, the local officials, the bailiffs, the constables, the judges, were themselves struggling to exist in a world where the old certainties had crumbled. Many of them had lost family members to the plague. Many of them had questioned whether the structures they had served were as eternal and God-ordained as they had been taught. Many of them, when they looked honestly at their situations, realized that trying to push wages back down was like trying to put back together a shattered bowl with your bare hands. It was possible in theory, but practically speaking, you were going to cut yourself. More fundamentally, the laws couldn't change the basic reality. There simply weren't enough workers. A master craftsman could forbid his journeyman from leaving, could legally prevent a laborer from working for another employer, could threaten punishment for breaking contracts, but he couldn't actually force workers to work if they decided to simply walk away. And in a world where the punishment for breaking a labor contract was harsh whipping, mutilation, sometimes death, but the reward for working in the next village was significantly higher wages and better conditions, more and more people chose to risk the punishment. Thomas watched this play out in London and in the villages around it. He saw a lord attempt to force peasants to work the fields at pre-plague wages. He saw those peasants, with nothing left to lose and everything to gain, simply leave, walking to the next village where they could earn twice as much and where a labor-desperate lord or farmer would pay what they asked. He saw the original lord, desperate and furious, attempt to bring them back through the force of law, sending bailiffs to capture them. He saw the peasants decide that the risk of being caught and punished was worth the potential reward, and flee further, to the cities where anonymity provided protection, and where the demand for labor was even more intense. The result was that the old manorial system, the foundation of feudal society for centuries, the system by which peasants were bound to the land and owed service to a lord in exchange for the right to work, was beginning to crack fundamentally. Lords found themselves unable to force peasants to work the land at the low wages the manorial system required. Peasants found themselves, for the first time in medieval history, with actual negotiating power. This would lead immediately to a complete overturning of the feudal system. Feudalism in modified forms would persist in parts of Europe until the 19th century. But the process of transformation had definitely begun. The rigid structure that had seemed eternal and unchangeable was starting to bend. Thomas benefited significantly from this transformation. By 1360, he had been working independently for over a decade. He had no official status, no guild recognition, but he had clients. He had a reputation for honest work and fair prices. He had accumulated some coin through his labor. He was beginning to think that he might actually be able to do something that would have been nearly impossible before the plague. Start his own business, become independent, own his own workshop. This would have been almost unthinkable in the pre-plague world. The guild system had controlled craft labor ruthlessly, preventing anyone who hadn't come up through the proper apprenticeship from practicing a trade. More than that, Even legitimate journeymen often faced enormous barriers to becoming independent masters. They had to accumulate enough capital to open a workshop, significant investment for someone earning wages. They had to purchase tools expensive and time-consuming to acquire. They had to establish a client base. They had to navigate the politics of the guild, often winning the favor of established masters before being permitted to set up their own shop. And they had to pay substantial fees to the guild to become a master. For someone like Thomas, a former apprentice without family connections or inherited wealth, such a path would have been nearly impossible in the pre-plague world. But the guilds had largely collapsed during the plague. They were being slowly rebuilt, but they had lost so much authority that it was now possible for someone like Thomas to set up a small operation without going through the traditional channels. He wasn't the only one doing this. Throughout Europe, people of humble origins were setting up businesses, taking over abandoned workshops, starting new trades. The rigid control that the guilds had once exercised was gone, at least temporarily. The institutions had been broken, and in the breaking, new possibilities had opened up. In 1362, Thomas found an opportunity that would change his life. A leatherworker named Robert had also survived the plague, and, like Thomas, had been working independently without guild recognition. The two men knew each other through the informal network of craftspeople who had rebuilt their trades in the chaos. They had seen each other at markets, heard each other mentioned by customers, gradually developed a working relationship. They approached the owner of a building that had been abandoned during the plague and negotiated a lease. They pooled their resources, a mixture of coins saved from their labor and goods they had acquired during the years of chaos. Together, they set up a small workshop in 1362. Thomas worked the metal, doing blacksmith work-making tools, simple weapons, household goods like nails and hinges and cooking implements. Robert processed leather, making belts, straps, simple armor, shoes. They worked side by side in a relatively cramped workshop, their crafts complementary. A customer might come in needing both a metal blade and a leather sheath. A soldier might need both armor and weapons. By combining their work, they could offer more value to customers than either could offer alone. Their prices were lower than the established craftsmen could afford to charge, because they didn't have to support the elaborate guild structures and apprenticeship systems. They didn't have to pay guild fees. They didn't have to maintain the expensive ceremonies and traditions that established guilds demanded. They also had access to labor markets that simply hadn't existed before, because there were no apprentices available through traditional guild channels. And because the normal rules were still so disrupted, they could hire help directly from the surviving population, paying whatever wage was necessary to get workers. The quality of their work was less refined than what the established craftsmen produced. Their techniques were less perfect. Their finishing was rougher, but the work was good enough. It was serviceable. It was affordable. And in a world where so many of the established craftspeople had died, where established workshops were struggling to rebuild, after the plague, where normal guild channels weren't functioning properly, where there was enormous demand for basic goods and tools and repairs, there was significant demand for honest work at fair prices. Within a few years, by 1365, Thomas and Robert were moderately successful, not wealthy by the standards of the merchant class, but comfortable. They could afford to hire a few workers. They had built a client base that kept them consistently employed. They were earning enough to save money, enough to think about the future with some confidence. And they had something else, something that would have been unthinkable for common craftspeople before the plague: agency. They had made decisions about their own future, outside the structures that had once controlled every aspect of a medieval person's life. They had chosen their business partner. They had chosen to go into business together. They had chosen the nature of their work and the location of their workshop. They had chosen their prices and their working conditions. But success brought new challenges, and these challenges came from an unexpected direction. The guilds, reconstituting themselves after the chaos of the plague years, began to reassert control. The most damaged guilds had largely ceased to function during the plague. Entire generations of masters had died. Apprenticeship systems had been completely disrupted. The accumulated knowledge and traditions of centuries had been lost or scattered. But by the 1370s, enough masters had survived, and enough new masters had been trained or had replaced dead masters, that the guilds were able to attempt to rebuild their authority. This rebuilding was not simply a restoration of the pre-plague system. The guilds were not as powerful as they had been before. Many of them were damaged beyond immediate repair. Some trades had been transformed by the plague in ways that made the old guild structures less relevant. The explosion of new craftspeople operating outside guild control meant that guild authority was fragmentary and contested, but guilds did begin to reassert control, particularly in the larger cities where their authority had been historically strongest. They passed laws limiting the number of craftsmen who could practice each trade. They tried to enforce apprenticeship requirements again, demanding that people who wanted to practice a craft had to serve proper apprenticeships. They attempted to create monopolies on certain kinds of work. They tried to drive unlicensed craftspeople out of business through legal pressure and sometimes through violence. They reimposed many of the fees and requirements that they had been unable to enforce during the plague years. Thomas and Robert found themselves facing a choice that many independent craftspeople faced in the 1370s. They could attempt to fight the guild's authority, remain independent, and risk legal action, confiscation of their goods, and potentially violent confrontation. Or they could attempt to join the reformed guild, accepting its rules and restrictions, but gaining the legitimacy and protection that guild membership offered. The choice was difficult. Part of Thomas wanted to remain independent. He had experienced freedom in the years after the plague. He had built his business on his own terms. He chafed at the idea of subjecting himself to guild rules again. But he also understood the practical realities. They could remain independent, but only by constantly fighting legal and social pressure. Other craftspeople would report them to the guild. Customers might be reluctant to buy from unlicensed craftspeople. Authorities might confiscate their goods or fine them. After some deliberation and discussion between Thomas, Robert, and their growing families, they chose to join. The decision was pragmatic, though it came with regret. They could remain independent, but only by constantly fighting. By joining the guild, they gained legitimacy. They could charge higher prices because customers knew they were buying from licensed, officially recognized craftspeople. They could train apprentices without legal risk. They could protect their market position against other independent craftspeople. They could participate in the institutions that governed their trade. The restrictions that guild membership imposed limitations on who could practice the craft, regulation of prices. Requirements about the quality of work were less destructive to their business than they had been before the plague, because the sheer demand for craft work was still so high. There weren't enough craftspeople to meet demand. Customers had to wait for work. Prices were high. The guild's monopoly was valuable precisely because there weren't enough craftspeople to break it. The reformed guilds were not the same as the pre-plague guilds, but they were not dramatically different either. They had been forced to adapt to changed conditions. They had to accept that they could no longer control labor as absolutely as they once had. They had to accept higher wages for workers than had been standard before the plague. They had to accept shorter apprenticeships. The brutal 14-year apprenticeships of the pre-plague period were now typically 7 or 8 years, partly because there was so much demand for trained workers that it made economic sense to accelerate training, and partly because apprentices had some leverage to demand better terms. The guilds had to accept that people could move between employers more freely, but they remained powerful institutions, and membership in them offered real advantages. By the late 1370s, Thomas and Robert were officially recognized as master craftsmen. The initial period of chaos, when they had operated in a kind of legal gray area outside the guild system, was over. They paid guild fees. They participated in guild ceremonies. They eventually began taking on apprentices according to guild rules, though the apprenticeships they offered were, by pre-plague standards, quite generous. The apprentices worked with less fear. The physical punishment was less severe. The hours were somewhat more reasonable. In exchange, the training period was shorter. The decision to join the guild represented a kind of consolidation of the post-plague transformations. The guilds were being rebuilt, and society was restabilizing. But the rebuilding and restabilization were not returning things to their pre-plague state. The guilds were adapted to new conditions. They had to operate in a world where labor was still scarce compared to pre-plague conditions. They had to compete with other craftspeople in ways that pre-plague guild monopolies hadn't required. And Thomas, having experienced life both inside and outside the reformed guild structures, understood that something fundamental had changed. The system was still there, still powerful, still controlling who could practice a craft, but it was not absolute. There were gaps in its authority. There were possibilities for people who were clever and fortunate enough to exploit them. The world was less determined than it had been before the plague. While Thomas was adapting to the changing structures of craft labor, much larger transformations were occurring across European society. The plague had killed not just people, but also certainties. The feudal system had been justified by a complete worldview that placed everyone in a fixed hierarchy ordained by God. You were born a peasant or a noble, and that was God's will for you. The church taught that suffering was spiritually necessary, that poverty was sanctifying, that the social order was divinely ordained. God had created this hierarchy, and your role in that hierarchy was fixed from birth. But the plague had killed noble and peasant alike. It had killed the Pope himself. It had killed the Archbishop. It had killed princes and paupers. It had revealed, in the most brutal way possible, that the claims of divine order and divine sanction were hollow. If God had ordained the social hierarchy, why had God killed so many people and disrupted the entire system? If the church had any power or any true connection to God, why hadn't the priests and bishops been able to stop the plague? Why had they died just like everyone else, often faster than average due to their proximity to the sick? These were not abstract philosophical questions, they were matters of lived experience. People had watched as the institutions that claimed to represent God had failed them completely. The church had no cure for the plague. The priests couldn't heal the sick. The bishops couldn't prevent death. The sacraments didn't protect. Prayer didn't work. The entire institutional apparatus of the medieval church had been revealed as powerless in the face of the plague. This was a crisis so profound that medieval consciousness was fundamentally shaken by it. The crisis of faith that followed the Black Death was visible everywhere in European culture. Some people turned inward, finding comfort in increasingly fervent religion, but others began to question. They began to wonder if the old certainties had been illusions all along. They began to consider that maybe God worked in ways the church didn't understand. Maybe the hierarchies that the church had blessed weren't actually divine. Maybe people had more agency and more power than the system had told them they had. The visual culture of the post-plague decades reflected this profound crisis. In the years before the plague, medieval art had been relatively static and changing. Styles had been passed down for generations without significant modification. Artists followed established patterns. They painted in ways their masters had taught them. Innovation was not valued. Tradition was everything. The subject matter was restricted, mostly religious themes. Some noble portraits, but always painted in the same way, following the same conventions. But in the decades after the plague, art began to change rapidly. Artists began to paint with more realism, more attention to individual detail. The stylized ethereal figures of pre-plague art, beautiful but inhuman and distant, gave way to more human, more recognizable figures. It was as if artists were trying to recapture what was real in a world where so much had been proven to be illusory. The painted saint wasn't just a symbol or a representation of an abstract ideal. It was a person, recognizable and particular. The dance of death emerged as a central artistic theme in the post-plague decades. Artists and poets began creating images and texts showing skeletons or corpses dancing with the living nobles and peasants, priests and lay people, young and old, all united in the inevitability of death. It was a visual and textual representation of the great leveling that the plague had achieved. No matter your status, no matter your wealth or power, death came for everyone. The king and the peasant ended up in the same grave. In that ultimate democracy of the grave, the social hierarchy seemed suddenly less important, less sacred, less ordained by God. If everyone died equally, if death was the great leveler, then perhaps the hierarchies that seemed so absolute in life were less eternal than people had believed. This artistic shift reflected a deeper philosophical shift. The plague had revealed that the medieval vision of a static, eternal social order was false. Everything was in flux. Everything could be lost. And if everything could be lost, then perhaps everything could be remade. The rigid patterns of pre-plague art gave way to more fluid, more varied, more realistic representations. The rigid patterns of pre-plague society gave way to more fluid, more contested, more flexible social arrangements. During the 1360s and 1370s, there was a flourishing of intellectual and artistic energy across Europe. It was as if the trauma of the plague had broken something open, released something creative that had been pent up. In Italy, thinkers began turning their attention to classical texts that had been largely neglected during the medieval period. They began studying ancient Greek and Latin writers with new attention and new appreciation. They began to appreciate classical literature and philosophy not as curiosities from a pagan past that needed to be corrected by Christian theology, but as valuable in themselves. This intellectual movement would eventually lead to the Renaissance. but its seeds were planted in the trauma and upheaval of the post-plague years. In England, the English language itself underwent a transformation in the post-plague decade. Before the plague, French had been the language of power and prestige. The Norman invasion of 1066 had established French as the language of the nobility. For 300 years, French had remained the language in which the powerful conducted their business, the language in which literature of importance was written, the language of the courts and the halls of power. English was the language of the common people, considered rustic and unsophisticated. It was the language of peasants and servants. But as the old feudal structures crumbled and the common people found themselves with more power and agency, their language began to rise in prestige. By the 1380s, English was being used for official documents. By the 1390s, major literary works were being written in English. The language of the conquered people was becoming the language of power. This linguistic transformation reflected the deeper social transformation that was occurring. The people who spoke English were no longer subordinate to the French-speaking nobility. The people had power now, economic power, and their language reflected that. Thomas watched some of these larger transformations from his workshop in London, though he didn't fully understand them as part of a vast historical shift. To him, they were simply the facts of his daily existence. The language spoken in his shop was a mixture of English and French, and the trade jargon of craftsmen. The customers who came to buy his goods were of all types: wealthy merchants, poor laborers, craftspeople trying to establish themselves, women running their own businesses, which would have been nearly impossible before the plague, when guild control was absolute, clergy, nobles, knights. The world was more fluid, more open, more varied than it had been before the plague. In 1365, Thomas took a major life decision. He married. Her name was Alice, and she was about 23 years old, making her slightly younger than Thomas, who was 31. Alice had also survived the plague, though her survival had taken a different path. Her family had been merchants, reasonably successful, involved in the cloth trade. But the plague had been devastating to her family. Her father had died in the initial outbreak of 1349. Her mother had died in the second wave. Her older brothers, who would have inherited the family business, had both died. By 1360, Alice was alone the sole surviving adult member of her family. In the pre-plague world, this would have been a disaster of significant proportions. A woman without a father, without brothers, without male relatives to claim her and her inheritance, would have been extremely vulnerable to predation and exploitation. She would likely have been forced into marriage by relatives seeking to gain control of her property. Or she would have entered a convent, which was the traditional refuge for women who couldn't marry, or for women whose families couldn't afford to marry them off. But in the post-plague world, with so many of the traditional structures disrupted, Alice had found another path. She had worked as a servant in a wealthy household, but like many survivors, she had moved on from that position, seeking something better. She had some skills in clothworking and dyeing that she had learned from her mother before the plague took her. She had done piecework for merchants, taking raw cloth and working it through various processes of dyeing and finishing. She had accumulated some small savings of her own and had developed a reputation as someone reliable and skilled. When Thomas proposed marriage in 1365, Alice brought those skills into the partnership. It was a marriage that made economic sense. Her skills in cloth and dyeing complemented Thomas S. metalworking and Robert S. leatherwork, creating a more complete business. But it was also a personal choice, which was significant. In the pre-plague world, marriage had largely been controlled by families and by guild structure. Marriages were arranged, used to form business partnerships between established families. A young craftsman like Thomas would have had no choice in the matter. He would have married whoever his father or his guildmaster decided he should marry, at whatever age that was convenient for the family's interests. The idea of a man choosing his own bride was radical. But in the post-plague world, with so many families destroyed and so many formal structures weakened, marriage was increasingly becoming a personal choice. Thomas and Alice chose each other, partly for economic reasons, but also partly for personal reasons. They married in the church, as was proper and necessary, but they made their own decision about whom to marry. This autonomy in the choice of spouse was a significant shift from pre-plague practice. Alice's marriage to Thomas and her integration into the family business represented another significant transformation. Alice brought practical skills to the business. She could work cloth and dyes in ways that Thomas and Robert couldn't. But more importantly, she brought a different perspective. She had been her family's heir until the plague took them. She had been educated beyond what was typical for a woman of her class. She could read some Latin. She had knowledge of accounting and business. She expected to participate in decision-making, not just to follow orders from her husband. By the standards of the post-plague world, this was not entirely unusual. With so many of the formal structures disrupted, women had moved into roles of greater independence and authority. Some ran their own businesses after their husbands died. Some negotiated with customers and suppliers. Some trained apprentices. Some managed complex financial arrangements. The guilds tried to reassert control over women's work as part of their overall attempt to rebuild authority in the post-plague world, but they were only partially successful. Women had tasted independence during the plague years, and many of them were unwilling to retreat completely back into the subordination that had been their pre-plague condition. It wasn't full equality. The culture was still fundamentally patriarchal. The law still considered women to be under the authority of their husbands. Women couldn't hold formal office or vote in guild matters. But it was a significant shift from the tightly controlled world of pre-plague craft production, where women had worked only as auxiliaries under the control of men. By 1367, Thomas and Alice had a child. By 1369, another. The smithy and the cloth workshop became not just a place of production, but a family business. Alice worked the dyes and cloth while nursing babies. Robert took on more responsibility for the day-to-day operations of the smithy, so that Thomas could explore new opportunities and new markets. This arrangement, where a woman was a full partner in a family business, where she was making decisions, negotiating with suppliers, managing finances, would have been nearly impossible before the plague. Their children grew up in this fluid, transformed world. They took for granted things that would have been shocking to their pre-plague ancestors. They saw women working alongside men in craftwork. They saw people of various social classes interacting as something approaching equals in the marketplace. They heard English spoken as often as French. They lived in a world where the old certainties had been broken and something new was being built. By the 1370s, Thomas and Alice were reasonably comfortable. They owned their workshop and a small house attached to it. They had a growing network of customers and suppliers. They employed several workers in the smithy and the cloth workshop. They had accumulated enough resources to provide for their family's needs and to think about providing opportunities for their children. They were building something that looked like it might last, might provide for their children's futures in a way that would have been nearly impossible for Thomas to imagine in the chaos of the 1350s. Thomas and Robert eventually made the decision to bring Robert's nephew into their business. The boy, also named Robert, was the son of Robert's brother who had died in the plague. The young Robert showed aptitude for the craft, and they brought him in as something between an apprentice and a family member. This training was much shorter and much less brutal than a traditional guild apprenticeship would have been. The young Robert worked beside the men who were training him, learning through participation rather than through strict obedience and harsh punishment. He was treated with respect, not beaten for minor mistakes. He was fed well and housed properly. After 3 years, he was effectively a journeyman, capable of doing skilled work. This informal, family-based approach to training would have been impossible under strict pre-plague guild rules. It was yet another sign of the transformation that the plague had set in motion. But the comfort that Thomas and Alice had achieved came with challenges. The plague had killed so many people that the population of Europe was vastly reduced. Different regions recovered at different rates. Some areas, particularly the Mediterranean regions hardest hit by the plague, remained depopulated for decades, their fields lying fallow, their cities half empty. Other areas, particularly in northern Europe, recovered more quickly, their populations growing again by the 1370s and 1380s as survivors had children and newcomers migrated to more prosperous regions. This created shifting economic conditions that forced constant adaptation. In the years immediately after the plague, with widespread labor shortage and enormous need for goods and services, the surviving workers enjoyed unprecedented advantages. A skilled worker could demand whatever wages he wanted. A laborer could move between employers, always able to find someone willing to pay more. A craftsman could set up a shop without going through the traditional guild channels. But as the population began to recover and grow, the balance of power slowly shifted back toward employers. By the 1370s, there were more people looking for work, which meant less leverage for workers to demand high wages. Young people who had survived the plague were now becoming adults, creating competition in the labor market. Refugees from depopulated areas were migrating to more prosperous regions, increasing the supply of available labor. Thomas and Alice found themselves needing to adapt to these changing economic conditions. The initial period of high profits from easy market conditions began to fade. Competition increased as more craftspeople set up workshops. The market became more crowded, more competitive, less forgiving of poor quality or unfair pricing. It was in this environment of emerging complexity that Thomas and Alice had to make strategic decisions about the future of their business. Should they try to join the Reformed Guild formally, with all its restrictions and regulations, but also its market protections? Should they remain independent, accepting greater freedom, but also greater risk? Should they try to expand into new areas or consolidate what they had? These weren't the kinds of decisions a medieval craftsman had typically faced before the plague. In the pre-plague world, your role was largely determined for you by birth and guild structure. You inherited your father's trade. You served your apprenticeship in the traditional way. You married into another craft family. You followed the rules of your guild, and that was your life. Variation from this path was possible but difficult, and often severely punished. But Thomas and Alice lived in a world where such predetermined paths no longer existed. They had to actively make decisions about their future. They had to consider multiple options, weigh different strategies, adapt as conditions changed. In a sense, they were doing the kind of economic thinking, strategic planning, market analysis, cost-benefit calculation that had previously been reserved for wealthy merchants and nobles. They were exercising a kind of economic agency and sophisticated decision-making that had been unthinkable for common craftspeople before the plague. After much deliberation between themselves and with Robert, they ultimately decided to join the Reformed Guild officially, something they had been contemplating for some time. It cost them money. Significant membership fees had to be paid on, imposed new restrictions on their labor practices. They had to agree to follow guild standards for quality of work. They had to limit the number of apprentices they could take on. They couldn't undercut guild prices too severely. They had to participate in guild ceremonies and maintain guild properties, but in exchange, they gained significant advantages. Their workshop became officially recognized as a legitimate operation. They could charge prices that reflected the guild's market control. They could protect themselves against competition from non-guild craftspeople through guild enforcement mechanisms. They could rely on guild support if they faced legal challenges. Most importantly, they gained security and legitimacy. After operating in a kind of legal gray area for over a decade, they now belonged to an established institution that provided structure and protection. The decision to join the guild represented a kind of consolidation of the post-plague transformations. The guilds were being rebuilt, and society was restabilizing. But the rebuilding and restabilization were not returning things to their pre-plague state. The guilds were adapted to new conditions. They had been forced to accept that they could no longer control labor as absolutely as they had before. They had to accept higher wages than had been standard pre-plague. They had to accept shorter apprenticeships. By the late 1370s, Thomas and Robert were officially recognized as master craftsmen. They paid guild fees and participated in ceremonies. The chaos had settled into new patterns. The extreme labor shortage had eased as population recovered. The most radical transformations had been consolidated into new structures. In 1381, the tensions that had been building in English society since the plague erupted into open rebellion. The Peasants' Revolt, also known as the Wat Tyler Rebellion, exploded across southern England. The immediate causes were complex: new taxes, attempts by the government to push wages back to pre-plague levels, the attempt to impose a new form of servile labor that was seen as an attempt to reimpose the old feudal system. But the deeper cause was that peasants, for the first time in medieval history, believed they could challenge the entire system. They had experienced the labor shortage of the post-plague decades. They understood that they had power. Peasants from multiple regions organized and marched on London. They burned buildings, executed nobles and priests, and demanded an end to serfdom. The rebellion was ultimately suppressed. Wat Tyler was killed. The rebel army was scattered, but the uprising revealed the depth of the transformation that the plague had set in motion. Thomas, now in his late 40s, watched the rebellion from London with a mixture of sympathy for the rebel demands and concern about the violence. He understood that the peasants' anger came from legitimate grievances. He also understood that the old order was unstable. It showed that change was possible. By the 1380s and 1390s, Thomas was establishing himself as one of the more successful and respected craftsmen in London. He had secured his family's position. His children were growing up with better education and more opportunities than he had had. He had wealth enough to support them and to give his children choices about their futures. Thomas died in 1392, at the age of 58. He had lived a full life by medieval standards. He had prospered. He had left behind a successful business, 2 adult children with families of their own, and a reputation as a good man and an honest craftsman. But more importantly, he left behind a living example of how the plague had transformed the world. His children, growing up in the post-plague world, took for granted freedoms and opportunities that would have been incomprehensible to pre-plague generations, and this transformation continued. Over the next century, the changes that the plague had set in motion would accelerate. The feudal system would gradually break down. Capitalism would begin to emerge. Nation-states would develop. All of these transformations had their roots in the upheaval caused by the Black Death. The plague had revealed that the medieval world was not eternal, not ordained by God, not unchangeable. In the chaos that followed, new possibilities emerged. A new world was being built. And the people who built that world, people like Thomas, who had survived the plague and understood that everything they had taken for granted could disappear, approached the work with a kind of determination and creativity born from trauma, but also from the recognition that change was possible. They rebuilt tomorrow, not as a return to yesterday, but as something fundamentally different.